Okay, thank you, Trista. It's great to get a chance to see everyone again. And as Trista has said, I'm not an academic and I'm not a researcher, but I have spent 17 years leading large education organizations. And last 2 years ago, I wrote a book called Imperfect Leadership. Can we just put the next slide on, please? Next slide. Thank you. The book was called Imperfect Leadership, a book for leaders who know they don't know it all. Now, why did I call the book with that title? Well, I called it that title because when I was reflecting upon my own leadership, I decided that the best term I could think of to describe it was imperfect. And it wasn't something I was ashamed of or embarrassed by. I'm actually proud to be an imperfect leader because I have a problem with this idea of perfect leadership. I think if we think we need to be perfect as leaders, we'll end up making ourselves physically or mentally ill. If we think we have to be perfect as leaders, we won't encourage others to share their leadership. We'll do it all ourselves. And if we think we have to be perfect as leaders, we won't encourage others to step up to leadership because they have to be perfect too. So the first book in 2019 was about my own leadership journey, things that I learned, mistakes that I'd made, how I gradually over time improved my leadership. And then just 2 weeks ago, we published the second book, the follow-up, Imperfect Leadership in Action, which I wrote with a wonderful leader of schools called Mary-Claire Brotherton. And it's actually got an excellent foreword by my friend and your friend, Andy Hargreaves. And in this book, we are trying to apply that specifically, those principles to school leadership. And in the book, we come up with 10 aspects of leadership mindset. The first one is about being self-aware, knowing your strengths and knowing your weaknesses, and how you tune into your context. The second one is about how because you know you're not perfect, you develop and empower your teams and get the most out of them. Because you know you're not perfect, you ask for help from others, and you manage your ego and acknowledging when you get things wrong. You make public promises because you know if you don't make the promises public, you mightn't do the really important things that you know you need to do. That you're a restless learner, carrying on learning because you're not perfect. Because you're not perfect, you don't just show power in your leadership, you show love and kindness in your leadership because everyone else is imperfect too. And because no one's perfect, you encourage others to step up to leadership. You're honest and authentic and you try and do the right thing. And finally, especially in times of crisis and uncertainty, you show up, and you show up with some hope and some pragmatism. So those are the 10 aspects of the imperfect leadership mindset that we write about in this new book. And I just want to focus on 2 of them today, being a restless learner and developing future leaders. And just to say before I move on, unlike most of our thought meets, we're not going to focus specifically on our systems or on policy. But today, in this first section of this thought meet anyway, we're going to focus on ourselves as leaders. It's going to get quite personal. I'm asking you to reflect upon your own leadership in the role that you're currently in. So first of all, our next slide, we're going to talk about being a restless learner. Go back a bit, please. I remember when I was the director of education in Merseyside in England, responsible for 80 schools. We decided to consult on closing a large number of our primary and secondary schools, our elementary schools and our high schools, all at the same time, because we had too many schools. And I knew we were going to reduce the number of high schools from 11 to 8. And I knew this was going to be very challenging, and I had to have a lot of public meetings, 15 public meetings, to be honest. And because I was in charge as the director, I decided to front those public meetings myself. And the first one was in a very challenging part of the local authority in Kirby, in Merseyside. And it went disastrously wrong. I handled it really badly. It got very nasty. People started to shout and swear at me. They asked me if I had children. And when I said I didn't have my own children, they said if I had children, I wouldn't do this to their children. So it got very personal. I handled it really badly. And at the end, when everyone left, I burst into tears. Then I thought, well, I've got 14 more of these public meetings to handle. I can't spend the next 3 months in tears. So I've got to learn how to improve my ability to handle these very difficult public meetings. And I found actually that feeling good is a skill, that you can learn it. I reflected upon my own practice, and each time I tried to improve what I'd done based on my previous performance. And I found towards the end of that series of public meetings, I was really good at it. And this is the point. Can we get the next slide, please? As an imperfect leader, we know we're not the finished product, so we remain open-minded and curious. We know that our leadership makes a big difference, so we learn from our mistakes and try to do better next time. And when we do make mistakes, as I made mistakes in that public meeting, we understand that we're not perfect. We are kind to ourselves, we learn from it, and then we move on. Next slide. We all make mistakes. It's important we give ourselves permission to do so. But the best leaders are able to be at their best more often. They reflect on it. They apply what they're learning in a more consistent way. Outstanding leaders aren't necessarily better leaders than the rest of us. They just operate at their best more often. We try to be not a different kind of leader from ourselves. We're still ourselves, but we try to be a better version of ourselves as leaders the next day compared to the previous day. Now, in that example of the public meeting, where I struggled at first and was doing things really badly, there was a sense of urgency for me because I didn't want to cry at the end of each meeting. I needed to get better because I had so many of these meetings to handle. But actually in our leadership, there's often not the urgent need to change. It's more gradual. It's not so instant. It's not like when a new teacher in a school, when the children misbehave, you have to change things urgently. But after a while, you become an experienced teacher and the need for change is not so urgent. So my question is, how do we get improvement as leaders when the need to change is not urgent? Next slide, please. Like teachers, leaders can form habits, develop ways of behaving that have served them well in the past and become instinctive. This can make it harder for leaders to change in the future. So just like teachers who after the first 2 or 3 years develop habits to enable them to teach better, and they do it more instinctively, same in leadership. After the first 2 or 3 years of leadership, we start to use those skills that we've learned and they become habits, they become instinctive, and that's a good thing. That's how we become more expert leaders. But it also means we can get stuck in those habits and we can fail to be good at changing when our context changes. I like this grid. Can we see the grid, please? As leaders, we want to be grown up and wise, but also restless and continuing to learn and not stuck. As young leaders, we may be in that bottom right-hand quadrant, enthusiastic, we're keen to learn, but we're making lots of mistakes like I was making in that public meeting. What we don't want to be definitely is on the left-hand quadrant where we're still learning, but we're already stuck. We stopped learning and we're not even wise yet. That's a very bad place to be as a leader. Sometimes some leaders can find themselves in that top left-hand quadrant. They've learned a lot. They're now leading instinctively, but they've become ground down. They've stopped learning. They've lost their edge. They're no longer restless. And what we want to be as leaders, all of us, in whatever kind of role we're in, is in that top right-hand quadrant, grown up, wise, and still learning and restless. Now, what can we do to stay restless in whatever role we're in? I think, next slide, please. I think the 4 things we can do is create an open to learning culture. Make learning about leadership part of the culture of our team and our senior team. Put ourselves firmly in the camp of learner 2. Model curiosity. Discuss with our team members what we are learning and ask them what they are learning. So we're creating a culture of talking and discussing about learning in leadership. Secondly, spend some time reviewing when things haven't gone well. Think about it, reflect upon it, and then practice self-compassion. Once you've reflected upon it, be kind to yourself and move on, and don't beat yourself up too much. And finally, use 360 feedback in a focused and time-specific way to improve an aspect of our leadership. Someone I know is a good friend of mine. He's the chief executive in England of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. It's a big charity in the UK. And 6 years into the job as CEO, he decided to do 360 feedback. He got feedback from a whole range of people, external stakeholders, different members of staff, and his senior team. And he used it to identify 2 areas he wanted to improve as a leader. And every month, he asked his senior team to discuss with him whether or not he was improving on those 2 aspects and reflect upon whether or not he was making headway in those aspects. After 6 months, he did 360 feedback again. And then after a year, he did it again. And he said there were 2 clear outcomes of this process. One was he definitely improved his leadership in those 2 aspects. And the second one was he developed a much more transparent and open learning senior leadership team. So just I want to stop for a moment now and get you to think about this. Can we get the next slide up, please? Reflect on what you've been at your best as a leader, when you've been at your best. So we want to be at our best more often. That's what good leadership is. Not trying to be somebody else, but be a better version of ourselves tomorrow. So reflect on when we've been at our best. Can we write down on the Learn Lab what hinders you from being at your best? So reflect on when you've been at your best as a leader and write down on Learn Lab what hinders you from being at your best. So quite a lot about being tired, overworked, and not having enough time. That's a key one. But also one about expectations of others, which is interesting. Any observations from you, Trista, about what you're seeing there?
A lot of exhaustion and that sense of urgency, the rushing that comes on, and reacting. So that response.
The most popular one there is having a robust team which challenges each other. That's a really great point.
Would it be okay if I made a comment at this point?
Sure, Andy.
Yeah, it's I'm not filling in the box here, but if it were me, I'd say one of the things that still prevents me from being at my best as a leader is wanting things too much. It's an inner problem. I think it's very important to want the basic vision and direction and purpose of your organization a lot, even too much. But wanting particular things or ways of implementing it or strategies or people too much is something I still have to reflect a lot about. And I say that because when I saw a lot of these coming up at first, I think we're looking a bit at the conditions around us that make it hard to be at our best, and perhaps not looking enough within ourselves at the things that prevent us from being our best.
Can I just say that's a great point, Andy? It's something that we try to address in the book, the importance of self-awareness and understanding what your default mechanisms are, what you like when you're tired, when you're stressed, what your drivers are, what motivates you, and what the downsides of that are. And having a strong self-awareness is a fundamental part of having a good imperfect leadership mindset. So it's not just about the conditions, it's about you as a person too, and you as a leader. Great point. Can we move on now, folks? Because I just want to talk about one more issue before we stop this discussion. And I want to talk about developing future leaders. So all of us as leaders have a role to develop others to become leaders too. Now, you often hear leaders in schools say, so-and-so is not ready for leadership. So-and-so hasn't done that yet. So-and-so hasn't got that experience yet, so they can't yet be a senior leader. I worry about people who habitually say that. I actually think that nobody is ready for leadership. It's always a big step up. In fact, I'd say if you step up into a more senior leadership role and you find it comfortable for the first 6 months, you're probably doing it wrongly. It always, none of us can be fully prepared for leadership. But my question is this: how do we help our colleagues to improve and develop as leaders? What do we do? Is it like the way in which schools help teachers to improve their teaching? Well, it's like that, but it's not like that. Let me give you an example. If you say we're going to improve a teacher to teach better, what we would normally do is spend some time in their classrooms, either as a coach or a member of their team or a peer, to watch them teach and help to give them feedback and discuss. But if I say, I'm going to watch you lead, what will I be watching? Will I be watching you chair a meeting, make a speech, do some emails, have a conversation, walk around the corridors? What will I be watching when I say I'm going to watch you lead? It's a bit more complex than that, I think. Now, when I was chief executive at the National College for School Leadership in England, we said there are 5 aspects of effective leadership development. Next slide. Can we go on to the next slide, please? That's it. Learning on the job. So if you want someone to learn to be a better leader, give them a chance to lead. Give them a leadership role, even if it's not necessarily a paid role, but give them a leadership responsibility. But that's not enough. Build in times for those people who are leading to get feedback, not from someone who doesn't see them, comes in once a year, but someone who works with them, either a peer or a mentor or a coach who can see their leadership and give them regular feedback about how they're doing. But even that's not enough, because you can just recycle what you see. And if you're not seeing exceptional, outstanding practice, you don't know you're not seeing it. So exposure to outstanding practice in other contexts is a key part of how we develop leaders. But also we need access to high quality research, to case studies and materials, to the research aspect. And often leadership development programs are very good at that aspect. And finally, time for reflection to discuss what we're learning as leaders. I'm actually wondering here what further role ARC might play to support the development of leaders in our different systems. Is there a way in which we, by getting together as a collaborative, we can expose our future leaders and our current leaders to outstanding practice in different contexts and build in coaching and mentoring and have access to that high quality research and that time for reflection? Is there something we could do even more about leadership development as part of the ARC collaborative? Next slide, please. Now, I want us to think now about why sometimes we don't delegate the really hard things that we do as leaders. And all of these things, all these 5 reasons here are things that I've been guilty of. So the first reason why I think sometimes we don't delegate the tough things is we think it's mission critical for the organization. It's too high risk to delegate it. We can't afford for it to go wrong, so we do it ourselves. The second reason is others expect it to be me, the CEO or the person in charge. Politicians expect it, or external stakeholders expect it, or staff expect it, so we do it instead of delegating it. The third reason is we're just better at it than our staff, so we do it. The fourth reason is we don't want to ask our staff to do it because they're too busy anyway, so we should do it. And the fifth reason is we just actually like control and we feel uncomfortable giving it away, even though we think we ought to. Now, I want to challenge these 5 assumptions because actually I think it's a narrow line between protecting our staff and disempowering our staff. And if we want our colleagues to learn to be leaders, how are they going to learn unless we give them the chance to do the hard things? Role play isn't enough. They've got to experience it. We've got to provide opportunities for them to have a go at these things. So I want to conduct a poll now. Could you think of the 2 reasons why you sometimes don't delegate the really tough things to your colleagues? Just think of just highlight the 2 reasons that are most true of you as to why you don't delegate. Let's see what people come up with. So the main 2 is risk, it's mission critical, and workload. I thought they would probably be the main 2. But it's interesting that we have got quite a few responses on the others as well. Thank you. Can we just move on to the next slide, please? So my question is, can we find ways in which We can give our colleagues responsibility for some of those really challenging things that we do, handling a very difficult staffing issue, chairing a really problematic meeting, fronting a formal and high-profile event. Other ways in which we can find opportunities to do this, because it's a core part of our role as leaders to develop other leaders, and we shouldn't expect it to be automatic. Each of our senior team will be different, with different development needs and different personalities. Some will need a lot of encouragement and confidence to step up. Others will be more confident. Some will be like us. Some will be quite unlike us. But they can all potentially be senior leaders, because it's not about personality. It's about expertise. You can have a highly skilled extrovert leader and a highly skilled introvert leader. It's about how they learn to be better leaders. And that's our role. When people step up to leadership, what normally happens is they start doing less of something they know they're already good at in order to do something they're not sure whether they're going to be good at it or not. And our job is to give them the confidence to help them to step up rather than expecting it to be automatic. So go back to that grid, the next slide, and let's look at the grid again. I talked about this earlier. So if we treat our young leaders, the ones in that bottom right-hand quadrant, as workhorses only, they'll eventually get fed up and go elsewhere. So we need to give them a chance to lead, invest in their development and support, create an environment and a culture where it's okay for them to take some risks with some help. And if we want to grow a more diverse group of leaders, then don't reinforce a single stereotypical view of leadership that might put some people off who are from more diverse backgrounds. And if we want our experienced leaders to retain their restlessness, who might be stuck in that top left-hand quadrant, then what we think about what more we can do to re-energize them and maybe shift their role a little bit. And this is an extract from the new book. At times, rather than look how to move people to different seats, in my own leadership, I've been too hasty to push people off the bus. And sometimes I've made that mistake and I have been too hasty. But other times I've found that changing the seating arrangements, creating a new role that's more suited to the skills and expertise of the individual concerned, has provided a new challenge for my senior leadership team member, and that's worked wonders. So let's think about how we renew and re-energize our more experienced leaders by giving them maybe a slightly different role. So we're encouraging our younger leaders and refreshing and renewing and re-energizing our older leaders. Let's get on to the last slide, please. So things to think about. What's the most challenging aspect of your current leadership role? How could you safely hand this over to another leader in your organization as part of their development with some help? That's a really great question to think about. Secondly, how can you ensure that every leader in your organization, including yourself, is working on a specific improvement in an aspect of leadership, rather like Peter Wanless did as chief executive of the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Thirdly, create a forum in which young and diverse leaders can safely and confidently challenge organizational assumptions. Ask them to identify areas of leadership which are too slow or too inflexible. Come up with suggestions how things can be done better. Value and treasure your young and diverse leaders. Give them opportunities to grow, take risks, and have a stronger voice in your organization. Proactively do that. And finally, think about ways to re-energize your more experienced leaders and make a better use of their wisdom and experience. So just to sum up, as I close, imperfect leadership is a mindset. It's not a set of competencies to be mastered. It's not a body of knowledge to be memorized. It's a mindset to be embraced. Adopting that mindset won't necessarily make your leadership less challenging, but it should certainly help you to feel less lonely.